Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence.
Do qualche secondo di tempo.
Let me give members who do not wish to participate in the debate a few seconds to leave the room.
So, sehr verehrte Kollegen und Kolleginnen.
So, colleagues, we now move on to the next item on the agenda. That's an interim report from Mrs. Christine Revaud-Dallon-Bonnefoy and Ms. Corazza-Bildt relating to the EU's accession to the Council of Europe Convention on Prevention and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. Could you have me the speakers list? Thank you. I'd like to give the rapporteur, Mrs. Revaud-Dallon, the floor first of all. You have 4 minutes, madam.
Merci, Madame la Présidente, Madame la Commissaire, Mesdames.
Thank you, President. Members, ladies and gentlemen, violence perpetrated against women and domestic violence are plagues which we have to contend with throughout Europe, and they require urgent attention. 1 woman out of 3 has been subject to a form of physical or sexual violence as of the age of 15. 1 out of 20 was raped. A woman dies every 3 days in France following domestic violence. So behind these figures there are tragedies which have destroyed the life of many women and children. Allow me to tell you of a true story. A young 25-year-old woman who was supported by the SOS Femmes movement in her department for several years. She lodged a complaint against her partner who had threatened to kill her, but that complaint was not followed through and was classified. She started divorce proceedings, but she was killed by her partner. And the older child, at the age of 11, tried to protect his mother when the partner was killing the mother, but unfortunately he was wounded. So this is the sort of thing which we have to face. We must really bear our responsibility, shoulder our responsibility by adhering to the Istanbul Convention. It's a strong tool to protect women wherever they live in Europe. The Istanbul Convention is the first international tool which is legally binding and which caters for violence perpetrated against women. It deals with violence, protection of victims, and prosecution of those liable for these acts. It's not just a question of dealing with the violence as such. We also need to change the mindset of our society. This violence should be seen in a broader context of lack of equality between men and women. Still today, women have to face sexism at home and at the workplace. They still earn less than men. They are still less represented in the higher echelons of companies. The media, too, still continue to convey stereotypes and degrading images. These are the concepts which are very much part and parcel of our society, and this is what we have to combat. I'm not suggesting that we be fatalistic here. I think that we should really try to become aware of the situation and express our will to change it. That's the first stop. first step. The first thing we must do is educate right from a very, very early age. Young girls and boys must be taught about sex equality, gender equality. And it is only by educating young children from an early age that it will be possible to ensure that a proper approach to these issues is ensured. So that I believe that all forms of discrimination, and the document produced by the UN has just said that if a woman is refused a safe abortion, this is indeed an infringement of her human rights and could be indeed compared to torture. Parliament has always expressed its opinion against reactionary positions adopted by governments and others. If a government can feels that it can take a decision in the place of a woman, well, these governments are wrong. These people are wrong. Think of the situation in Spain and in 2014 and in Poland in 2016. Women in these countries have expressed their will, and this is a sign of great hope for us. We think that the conservative governments must be made aware of the fact that not all agree. Could I remind you that a very, very large proportion of the population is affected by this, and allow me to thank Madam Corazza-Bildt and all those who've contributed to the work which went into this report. But it's just an initial report. It's the first step. I think that we have to be very careful about how this convention is implemented. This is what is really at stake. We need the necessary human resources to be made available so that this will really have an impact on the life of women. So I call on the European Union for a global strategy with a legislative act on prevention and combating violence perpetrated against women. This is urgent. We cannot wait. All women in Europe are entitled to live without violence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll now give the floor to the second rapporteur, Ms. Corazza-Bildt, 4 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Chère Christine, mon co-rapporteur.
Christine.
Today, many women and girls live in fear and despair, bleeding in their body and mind, hurt and crushed by shame. And today, with our report, we give a voice to the millions of women whose life is devastated by violence, saying loud and clear, you're not alone, and we care. We also send a message of support to all those committed to protect women and girls, authorities, civil society, and we pay tribute to their work and tell them that the aim with the accession of the Istanbul Convention of the European Union is to give them more tools, a better legal framework to prevent and combat violence against women and domestic violence and protect victims. Violence against women is a terrible crime and should be punished as such. In Europe today, at home, women continue to be beaten, and often in front of their children. In public places, women risk to be harassed and raped, going to a swimming pool, a music festival, a beach. And more young women are harassed and persecuted on the net. And on social media, it has become a global phenomenon. I think about Tiziana, a young woman who committed suicide because of spreading her intimate videos by her ex-boyfriend. And Maria Rashidi, disfigured with acid by her husband, who, like Lucia, had the courage to denounce him and became women's rights activists. Many teenagers are raped, too drunk to defend themselves, with friends taking videos and publish on the social media, thinking it's funny. It's new forms of violence, revenge pornography, sex extortion, voyeurism. Violence is now trivialized and victims are mocked. Freedom from violence, dear colleagues, is a fundamental right. And the Istanbul Convention is the first and only international legal binding act that criminalizes violence against women and recognizes the gender-based violence as a breach of human rights and a form of discrimination. Let's be clear. We're talking about men violence against women, out of jealousy, revenge, frustration, alcohol. Often they can't accept a woman to be strong, independent, modern, making her own choices and dare to live them. Often the cultural clash for families coming from other countries and young women who just want to live like their schoolmates in a dress in a Western way of living is too strong for their own families to accept. Is there really any honor to kill a girl just because she has decided to take off her scarf? It happened in Sweden 2 weeks ago. She thought she was in Europe and she could be free. Violence against women is too often tolerated and seen as a private issue, and we need to ensure more conviction of perpetrators. The Convention provides for strict sanctions to combat impunity and extension measures to protect victims, such as restraining order, shelters, medical and psychological assistance, prevention measures, training of officials, education programmes, responsible media and combat stereotypes. It recognises that in order to eradicate violence against women, we need to improve equality between women and men, change mentality, combat sexism and empower women. It is time to shift the guilt from the victim to the perpetrator. Women must feel that it's worth going through a painful process of telling the terrible stories, the shame, the embarrassment, unless there is a credible judicial follow-up. Member States have to criminalise by law gender-based violence and also ensure that perpetrators are brought to justice. I visited shelters in Sweden, Italy, Malta, Greece, and many dedicated persons to help women victims. More resources have to be given to them. Madam Chair, I would like to finish by saying that I welcome the historical step forward of the EU signing of the Istanbul Convention in May this year. Now Member States need all to ratify it and implement it, and we have to continue to join forces also in this Parliament. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor to Commissioner Jourová.
Honourable members, ladies and gentlemen, I am honoured to speak once again to you about gender-based violence. Your interim report is forceful and ambitious and thus reflects the urgency to take more and concrete actions against this tragedy affecting millions of women and girls individually and society as a whole all over Europe. I am grateful to both rapporteurs, Madame Anna Maria Corazza Bildt and Madame Christine Revault d'Allon Bonnefoy, for the huge and joint effort made in preparing the document, informed by a number of hearings that allowed gaining better insights into the phenomenon and the many challenges, both legal and practical, in combating it. I would also want to extend my thanks to the members of the JURI Committee for the valuable input that the process received through the opinion adopted by this committee. The Commission welcomes very much the report's strong recognition of the Istanbul Convention as the best available tool to step up, together with the Member States, the European Union's efforts in tune with our existing policy and legal framework and the Union's international human rights agenda. Firmly rooted in international human rights instruments on gender equality, the Istanbul Convention is, on the one hand, the most comprehensive and holistic convention for the time being, and, on the other hand, a highly pragmatic instrument. It requires precise actions to be taken and parties to be accounted for. Therefore, I am glad that the EU signed the Istanbul Convention in June as part of the Commission's efforts in this year of focused actions to eliminate violence against women. The Commission will continue to push the progress towards the EU ratification in the ongoing Council discussions on the terms of conclusion. Still, let me recall the mixed character of the Convention, which includes areas that are not covered by Union exclusive competence. This will continue to raise difficult and sometimes sensitive questions that we will need to reconcile with the political ambitions that are widely shared with the vast majority of Member States. Beyond the strong support for the Union's accession expressed in the report, we are also grateful for the many concrete indications on how to arrange the EU's future implementation of the Convention's obligations, both in organisational and substantive terms. We will give them thorough consideration. The report rightly emphasises the need to give particular attention to vulnerable groups to address their specific needs, such as women and girls refugees, and to enable all victims to actually use support facilities, as well as the links between violence and economic dependence and empowerment, and the related need to see our efforts to combat violence as part of our overall strategy to achieve full and genuine gender equality in the European Union. I would like to use this opportunity to inform you that this year the annual European Commission colloquium on fundamental rights, led by the First Vice President Timmermans and myself, will be dedicated to women's rights, and that violence against women is one of the key topics on its agenda. It will take place on the 20 and 21st November. I am pleased that the parliamentary event on violence against women will also take place on the 21st November. These initiatives from the Commission and the Parliament will bring the issue of violence to the forefront of the political agenda in the EU, a place where it deserves to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Commissioner. I'll now give the floor to Mr. MAŠTÁLKA on behalf of the Legal Affairs Committee. 1 minute, sir.
Děkuji, paní předsedající, kolegyně.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam President. Colleagues, now, it's sad to say today that 1 out of every 3 women in Europe will experience some kind of physical or sexual violence. 1 out of every 5 women is a victim of some kind of online stalking or harassment. The amount the EU spends on this, on gender-specific violence, have been estimated, or the cost of this, at 228 billion a year. In my own country, the Czech Republic, it is estimated that there are about 6,000 rapes a year, and only a tenth are investigated or report. This is a terrible figure. The Istanbul Convention we're discussing today seeks to enshrine support for victims, persecution of perpetrators, and also prevention. In the Legal Affairs Committee, we unanimously agreed that the EU should become a party to this convention. It's an efficient and binding instrument for the EU, which will mean that we will eradicate this scourge. Thank you very much. We now move on to the speakers on behalf of the political groups. First up, for the European People's Party, Mrs. Matera. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, President. Allow me first of all to congratulate the Maltese presidency, which did its utmost to ensure that the convention was signed. I'd also like to thank my colleagues, rapporteur, for the excellent work which has been done. Now, although this is an interim report, it is important that the European Parliament reiterate its clear, firm position against violence against women. Violence against women is an endemic social plague. It's deeply rooted in our society. It knows no borders in Europe nor elsewhere. Women have to face abuse on a daily basis, and this has devastating psychological and physical consequences. The statistics need to be updated every hour, every minute, every second. The European Union has made gender equality one of its founding principles, but very often women have to work much harder than men to ensure that their rights are recognized, and they are the object of considerable discrimination in their participation in the economic, social and political circles of our society, and they're also excluded from many decision-making processes. If, in addition to this, violence is also taken into account, well, gender equality pales into insignificance. This is what has guided me in my 8 years as member of the European Parliament. I've taken part in a number of initiatives asking for the EU to sign the convention, the Council of Europe Convention against violence against women. Now, apart from the legal context of this convention, this will be clearly sending a clear message to the outside world as to the EU's wish to combat the phenomenon. Here we cannot say that Europe is the only player. This has been a matter of national competence. There have been different reactions at a national level, different types of sanctions imposed, and the type of support provided to women has varied too. I had to add a lot. I wanted to add a lot, but I see I've run out of time. Thank you very much, President.
Thank you very much indeed. Regrettably, there's too much to say on topics such as these. Now, on behalf of the Socialists and Democrats in the European Parliament, Mrs. García Pérez, you have 2 minutes, madam.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you, President. Well, we have been calling for gender violence to be a problem that relates to public order for a long time now. This is a problem that needs to be shared by the whole of society, rather than being something that needs to be resolved by individuals. This is an important issue, and therefore we're very pleased that this debate is taking place today on accession to the Istanbul Convention, because the Istanbul Convention is the legal instrument that can have the most impact at the moment when it comes to fighting gender-based violence. Here there is a social scourge taking place. There are women who are being murdered by men simply because they live in unequal societies, simply because they are women. And it is the shared responsibility of all institutions, including the European institutions, to deal with this situation. The Commissioner also mentioned the most vulnerable groups, and here we want to make a specific reference to the situation of a particularly vulnerable group, i.e. minors, in which gender-based violence has taken place. And let me announce here that my group will, for the next discussion with the European Commission, will be calling for a debate on this issue, and we hope we'll get support from other political groups. We want a discussion on the protection of the rights of minors who have been victims of gender-based violence within families, because there can be reinforced cooperation, for example, as member states have done when it came to the Lisbon rules or the Rome rules in this area. And it's very important to talk about the rights of minors. It's very important to talk about protecting minors, because they're the most vulnerable victims. We cannot allow any more complicit silence when it comes to gender-based violence, because we're talking about 50% of the population. We're talking about women who need to call for equal rights between themselves and the rest of society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For the European Conservatives and Reformists, I give the floor to Mrs. Stevens. The floor. 1 minute.
Dank u wel, voorzitter, collega's.
Thank you very much, President. Violence against women and gender inequality are still underestimated. And of course, we can't accept any type of violence against women or men and children. Now, according to an EU Institute for according to the Agency for Fundamental Rights, women have been subject to violence in very large numbers, and women run higher risks of being abused than men. The figures are frightening. Now, the EU must join the Istanbul Treaty. We must put an end to violence against women and against young girls. Not all member states have ratified the convention. Belgium has. All member states must ratify. A lot can be done in terms of the rights of victims, and cooperation in criminal proceedings is also possible. We must make this a priority. It is high time that we do so.
And now for the Liberals and Democrats, I give the floor to Ms. MLINAR. 1 minute. Thank you, Madam President. As an advocate for human rights and women's rights, I welcome the fact that the European Union should accede to the Istanbul Convention. It's an effective instrument, and the European Union should take a lead in fighting against violence against women. It should continue to do that. This is a binding legal act that is seen as a reference point globally, a golden standard, if you will. But I must express a regret at Council's decision not to accede to the Convention in its entirety, to just focus on a few chapters. Our declared and stated aim must be that the European Union joins this Convention and means a tangible difference in the fight against violence against women. That means we have to be ambitious. We must choose the ambitious way forward, not the simple one. Rights, women's rights, we can't be taken for granted. Never. We will be unstinting and untiring in an effort to fight against this scourge, and we hope that a younger generation of Europeans will see violence against women as completely intolerable, as something that can never ever be justified. Thank you. Thank you very much. And now for the Confederal Group of the European United, I've not agreed enough to give the floor to Mrs. KUNEVA for 1 minute 30.
Thank you, President. Every minute that we remain silent, another woman becomes a victim of psychological, sexual, or verbal violence within a family. The Istanbul Convention can break this so-called silence, and it can do that by ending impunity and by protecting victims. It can do that by preventing the different forms of violence. Colleagues, is ratifying this convention enough? We're in favour, but obviously that's not enough. We need it to come into force as rapidly as possible, and we also need to take innovative measures. I would suggest some kind of pan-European measures to help the victims of gender-based and domestic violence, along the lines of Rule 112, and I would ask the Commission to look into that. Let's not forget that society prepares the crime, but it's the criminal which commits the crime. That's what Victor Hugo said in Les Miserables. So if we want to ensure that we have a culture of peace, we need to ensure that no one is a victim, no one is an executioner, and that no one simply stands by and watches what's going on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For the group of the Greens European Free Alliance, I'll give the floor to Ms. Reintke. You have 2 minutes, madam.
A month ago, I was walking home from a night out with friends, and while I was approaching Duisburg main station, a guy came up to me from the back very suddenly, without me seeing him beforehand, and grabbed me between my legs. And I turned around. I was in complete shock. I was in outrage. I tried to run after him and scream at him, curse at him, only with one thought in my head, that if I scare him enough, he will not do this to any other woman again in his life. After a while, after a couple of blocks, I lost him in the dark, and I called the police. And the police came straight away with 3 cars. They interrogated me. They asked me if I was feeling fine, if I needed psychological support. They called for a search to find this guy. They even took my jacket and my dress to find traces. And I felt safe again. They brought me home. I felt taken seriously in this moment. And I know that this police reaction I owe to the debates that we had in the last months around the Istanbul Convention. And that is why I want to now say my thanks to all the women in this chamber, but also in the member states and all over the world who have fought for this to happen. But still, even though I had this positive experience, there are thousands and tens of thousands of women who do not get this treatment when they are being harassed or when they are facing sexualized violence. they are still facing being ridiculed and not being taken seriously. And without millions of women who fought for this convention and for other steps that were taken against violence against women, this would not have been possible. So without these forefighters and without documents like the Istanbul Convention, the fight against violence against women is still not a given. And the fact that I could feel safe and the fact that we are struggling to have every single woman in the world feeling safe needs to be our motivation to continue and to exceed the Istanbul Convention in the full scope and to not let one day pass without fighting against violence against women. So we need to take this step now. This will certainly not be the last step, but a very, very important and historic step on the way to a society without violence against women. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now, on behalf of the Europe of Freedom and Direct Democracy, I give the floor to Ms. Parker, 3 minutes.
Thank you, President. Violence against women, and indeed all kinds of violence against any gender, is something that all sides of the political spectrum can unanimously condemn. The UK has for many years played a leading role in protecting women, and this has statistically led to a decrease in domestic violence cases. Despite this improvement, it is reported that in 2016 alone there were at least 1.3 million female victims of domestic abuse in the United Kingdom. This is quite simply unacceptable in the 21st century, and more must be done to tackle this worrying statistic. Many member states in this union, including the United Kingdom, are working towards making the necessary legislative changes to meet the criteria of the Istanbul Convention to allow full ratification. The EU accession to this convention therefore serves to provide the political leverage for the EU to further control and implementation of this convention in member states. National legislation, tougher judicial punishments, and a greater emphasis on educating citizens is the best way to significantly combat violence against women across Europe. Thank you, President.
Thank you very much. And now for the Europe of Nations and Freedom, I give the floor to Ms. TROSZCZYNSKI, 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, President. The proposal of the EU to join the convention, the Istanbul Convention, poses a series of legal and political problems. Violence against women, regardless of its origin or its form, must be fought against ferociously. Women are very important to us because they give up life, and no society could accept any violence against women, any woman in the world. France, like all countries of the EU, fights on a daily basis against any type of violence perpetrated against women. Sometimes our leaders are not very clear-headed with regard to the threats, such as radical Islam, for instance, but they're the only people who have the appropriate criminal tools to combat this type of violence. The EU is definitely not the legitimate body to join the convention or indeed to ratify it. Only sovereign member states may do so, and I'm sure that you will have noted the fact that only 14 out of 28 member states have signed it. Well, this request to ratify the convention is another sign that you wish to promote a super-state decision-making process. Once it's promoted by, or once the convention is joined by the EU, member states would be obliged to do so. So much by way of the presentation. To go on to the substance now, we could perhaps have dealt with the legitimate topic of violence against women had the way you presented this issue been different. Why are member states refusing to ratify the convention, which has to do with violence against women? Well, they are aware of the ideological position adopted and inherent in the convention. Once the convention is ratified and imposed on member states, any criticism regarding gender, sex, color, language, religion, fortune, birth, sexual orientation, age, migrant status, refugee status, opinions, national, social or political opinions, anything of this kind could be condemned. Your text will not protect women. It's really an attempt to establish a community system whereby all the words can be used in the appropriate manner. So in your text, you do not mention this, which is why I would like to emphasize the importance of European women who are threatened by migrants who simply cannot be controlled. We see this on a daily basis. Unfortunately, sordid examples are before our eyes. This is because of the migration policy, the suicide type of migration policy which we're promoting. This is a distorted vision of women. Think of all the saints, Saint Geneviève, Joan of Arc, Marie Curie. They didn't need your quotas and your policies to show their great courage and valor.
Als Fraktionsloser hat...
Now, as an unattached member, I give the floor to Mr. Synadinos. 1 minute.
Madam President, I would acknowledge the work that's gone into human rights. We obviously have to protect victims and take measures to prevent scourges such as this. However, all we're doing here is just to trot out certain stereotypes. There are certain groups that are established by means of NGOs, and some of these NGOs, of course, end up just protected immigrants. The text is being read at an impossible speed. If the aim is to fight against violence, then I'd suggest that we help women who suffer domestic violence. Similarly, the Commission must limit itself to ensure the implementation of international cooperation. Any kind of violence should be managed or prosecuted by Member States and Member States only. Thank you.
Das waren nun die Redner und Rednerinnen.
So those were the speakers on behalf of the political groups. Now we move on to the rest of the speakers list. Firstly, Mrs. Zaborska, 1.5 minutes. Thank you very much, President, Commissioner. Now, many people that know that I'm committed in the fight against violence against women and children. I receive thousands of emails from the citizens of Slovakia, however, who don't agree with the EU acceding to the Istanbul Convention. The fight against violence against women and educating and ensuring that there is prevention in this fight is the competence of member states. Now, were the European Union to accede to this convention, they would be violating the Lisbon Treaty and overstepping their competences. I think that this is something that shouldn't be done. The European Union is overstepping its bounds. Now, the European Union can't simply adopt rules that thousands of people across the EU are against. Many people have signed and said that they're against. We need to ensure that we follow the correspondence of our voters, and I would suggest to Mr. Tajani that prior to tomorrow's vote, all those emails reach the right people, because otherwise we won't be following the wishes of our people. Thank you.
Sie haben 2 Minuten.
Mr. Weidenholzer, 2 minutes.
This year, we still have a very worrying trend of violence being trivialized, and that, of course, also affects violence against women. This is shocking. It's happening everywhere, in all walks of life, in all member states. And it's almost become acceptable to use sexist language in jokes. It all begins with words at the end of the day. The Istanbul Convention is an attempt of the community of states to put an end to this kind of behavior, to these actions. Violence against women and domestic violence are breaches of human rights and should be prosecuted along those lines. In all phases, the European Parliament has argued in favor of moving ahead with these things, and it's fair to say that everything's taken way too long. Be that as it may, we shouldn't just leave it at speechifying. Implementation is what we need. Implementation of existing legislation so that it becomes genuinely effective. The resolution of the Women's Committee and the Civil Liberties Committee heads in the right direction and gives pointers for the future. What's especially important is that education and investigation measures are adopted. No, it's not acceptable that young people see violence as something cool, and we must also generate awareness amongst the state institutions, the police and justice system and so forth. They've got to be aware of this problem. Otherwise, it's just all on paper and wishful thinking, and that is simply unacceptable. Thank you.
Herr Weidenholzer, Sie haben eine...
Mr. Weidenholzer, there's a blue card for you from Mr. Jurek. Will you accept that?
Ja?
Danke.
Gut, Herr Jurek.
No, thank you. Mr. Jurek, then, please, says the President.
Hat abgelehnt? Hast du abgelehnt?
Did you say no? Sorry, I apologise. You refused to take the blue card. I apologise, says the President. I misunderstood. So, moving on to Mrs. Girling. 1 minute, please.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Violence against women and domestic violence are inexcusable acts that achieve nothing other than undue suffering, misery and inequality on an unjustifiable scale. Both have existed for far too long and have claimed too many victims. Both constitute a gross violation of human rights, and it cannot be clearer that action is urgently needed. The Istanbul Convention, the first legally binding instrument on preventing and combating violence against women and domestic violence at the international level, opens the door to fundamental change. It provides the recognition and the tools needed to put an end to the long history of such appalling violence, which has devastating consequences for individuals, families and society. As a whole, I therefore urge all member states that have not already done so to work towards the swiftest possible ratification of this convention. However, unfortunately, some aspects of the interim report go way beyond the scope of the convention and encroach upon the competency of the member states themselves. I want to be absolutely clear that it is for this reason, and this reason alone, that I do not support this report and will, unfortunately, because other members haven't listened to those of us who had that reservation, I will have to be abstaining on this report.
Becerra, das Wort für eine Minute.
Mrs. Becerra, 1 minute, please. Thank you, President, and thank you, Commissioner, for your tireless work. The Istanbul Convention is a legal milestone and an essential achievement to protect women from violence right across Europe. But it's shameful that only half of member states have ratified it. I mean, I don't really know what to think. I can find no argument to justify that. And not even those countries that have ratified the convention can be satisfied. In Spain, my country, ratification took place 3 years ago and no concrete measures have been taken. Recently, a state pact was signed against gender-based violence between the main political parties, but it shows a distinct lack of ambition when compared with the Istanbul Convention. We don't need more pacts, photographs, we don't need photo opportunities, excuse me, we don't need more words. We need the Istanbul Convention and we need clear measures. Only legal changes will produce cultural changes. We need to give ourselves the most important tool against gender-based violence. This is the only way to protect the most vulnerable. I would turn to the governments right across Europe and say, please do your jobs. Thank you.
Herr Pimenta, Sie haben eine Minute.
Mr. Pimenta Lopez, you have 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. Violence against women, like domestic violence, is down to all sorts of complex, serious political and cultural causes. These can't be overlooked. These causes are getting worse in our societies. These causes are interconnected. They link in with psychological dynamics. It means that women end up feeling guilty, feeling painted into a corner. They feel responsible for keeping the family together at all costs and suffer all sorts of social and family pressure. Eradicating violence against women in all its manifestations cannot be dissociated from making effective and real women's rights in society, in law and in practical terms. They have to have full involvement in social, political, sporting life, as well as family life. The role of women is one that makes them secondary. We need a culture which is based on freedom, democracy and equality, as well as justice and real progress. We really need to implement these values. Thank you.
Mrs. Aiuto, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you, President. Colleagues, today the European Union is officially joining the Istanbul Convention, although only for cooperation for criminal proceedings and for the refoulement procedures. This is a controversial convention, undoubtedly, but it's definitely a tool which helps us combat violence against women throughout the EU. However, the fact that many member states have not yet ratified the document means that it is not really possible to assess the effectiveness of the measures provided in this convention. With this report, the Parliament takes note of the very serious situation facing women, but this should not be the end of a procedure, but the beginning. We don't want just theoretical we don't want the theory, we want more than words. Despite the fact that the text is being adopted by some member states, there is still a lot of violence being perpetrated against women, as we can see from the press. The European Court for Human Rights handed down a judgment last March, and Italy, one of the first countries to sign the convention, was considered not to have adequately protected a victim of domestic violence, and Italy has been sentenced to pay damages. So the mere act of ratification is not sufficient to stop violence. We need synergies between the legislative and the judicial authorities. We need to involve the police and all social carers. The judiciary should be closer to women, should be swifter and should be certain. We also need to implement the appropriate economic resources available in all the different establishments set up to help women, particularly minors, where it is even more difficult to declare, to report domestic violence in particular. I want my daughter and your daughters to be able to walk the streets of Europe without being the victims of violence, and this is the goal which we wish to achieve.
Mr. Obermeier, 3 minutes.
Der Beitritt zur Istanbuler Konvention.
Accession to the Istanbul Convention is certainly a good thing. It's interesting, to say the least. But it's not going to solve the problems we have in Europe. Let me tell you about a dark chapter here. Something that 15 years ago was unthinkable in the European Union is unfortunately now a bitter reality. Religion-based violence against women is now a fact based on Sharia law. This is something that our courts are having to deal with more and more. We're talking about women who are second and third generation migrants, and they are really suffering. These terrible facts that are also being carried out on children are increasing. Some children are being taken abroad, etc. And I ask myself, what does that say about our European values? For example, what happened in Cologne on New Year's Eve 2016? I mean, what about that? There we had mass sexual violence being carried out on women, and that really clearly shows where we're going. It shows the view that Islamic fundamentalists have of European Western women, and things are getting worse, not least because of the mass migration the European Union is not acting here and it is ignoring these social and religious-based problems. Gender budgets may well be increased, but that's not going to help. We need to cut the Gordian knot here. We need to ensure that gender-based violence is properly dealt with. Obviously, it's not a private matter, and we're not going to simply be able to do away with it in the way we're acting now. Thank you.
Minute 30.
Mr. Coelho, 1.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam President. First of all, my congratulations to our colleague Corazza Bildt for everything she's done in this fight, and also to all colleagues that are united with us. The fight against discrimination must be a shared cause, regardless of whether we're men, women, young or old. It's a shared purpose and a fundamental issue that unites us in Europe. Violence against women, particularly domestic violence, is both cause and effect for discrimination. And too many women are regrettably victims of this. Preventing and punishing this practice is essential, and this practice is intolerable. Everyone's got to be involved in fighting it. Local communities, member states and the European Union. The Istanbul Convention is an excellent instrument for this purpose. Therefore, I would call on all member states who haven't yet acceded to the convention to do so quickly. And I agree that the European Union should also accede to the convention, so that where it has responsibility, it should move ahead and act to implement the convention and fight against discrimination. Dear colleagues, we must fight this suffering and lay the groundwork so that European women live freely and without fear. Let's not get fixated on the actual tool. Let's focus on what we're really concerned about. There are still women in Europe suffering. That's got to end. Thank you.
Frau Neuchel.
Mrs. Neuchel now, 1 minute. Thank you very much. Commissioner, President, well, I'm particularly pleased that you're chairing today, Mrs. Gebhardt, because you've been working on this issue for an awfully long time now, and I'd like to thank you for your efforts. I would like to say to the previous speaker that the issue of gender-based violence certainly hasn't come to Europe with migrants and refugees. He must have been living in a different place over the last decades. This has been an issue here in Europe for decades and longer. You can hear that the impatience is growing in my voice. You can hear it in the way that I'm speaking. We need finally to act to ensure that something is done. Perpetrators need to be named and punished. Victims need to be assisted. We need to ensure that we no longer have sexual and gender-based violence in our Christian cities. This is not a problem with refugees, migrants and Islamism alone. This issue, Commissioner, is in good hands with you, I believe. Please, let's do something in Europe. Thank you.
Eine Minute.
Thank you. Mr. Škripek, you have a minute.
Vážená pani predsedajúca, vážená pani komisárka.
Thank you very much, Madam President, Madam Commissioner. The Istanbul Convention has some important objectives in terms of fighting against violence against women. But there are problems. Any kind of violence, regardless against women or not, against children, the elderly, people with disabilities, or any kind of violence should be condemned. I have to say I welcome any instruments, legislative or non-legislative, that fight against violence. Ultimately, it's the member states, though, that can intervene best. However, the Commission's making certain proposals which undermine the essential principles of the European Union. Here, the European Parliament's proposal goes, way beyond its reach or responsibilities. I think also I'm a bit worried about this kind of gender ideology which seeks to establish a social construct built on the differences between men and women. So I don't have a problem with the content of this, but it's the wrong instrument and people are overstepping their responsibilities. Thank you.
Mrs. Bilbao now, 1 minute.
Gracias a las ponentes.
Thank you, President. I'd like to thank the rapporteurs and Commissioner Jourová as well for their work. Gender-based violence affects 250 million women in Europe and costs us 230 billion euros a year. And I think these figures justify the European institutions acceding to the Istanbul Convention. This measure will enable us to have a consistent legal framework in all member states, will enable us to improve prevention measures and the fight against this scourge, and will help us to protect and compensate victims better for their suffering under what we call domestic terrorism. Now, the threats and cries that we hear from next door are a problem that we should all be dealing with. The values that push these perpetrators are corrosive. Stereotypes that we transmit in education or in the media are deadly. And that's why this struggle begins with each and every one of us. And this individual action requires and deserves the utmost institutional support. Thank you. Mrs. Vallina now, 1 minute.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, Madam President. We certainly welcome the ratification of the Istanbul Convention, and we would appeal to member states who haven't yet ratified to go ahead and do so. This convention acknowledges that violence against women is a breach of human rights, and that's very important on paper, but out of respect for the victims of sexist violence, we shouldn't engage any kind of triumphalism. We must step up our efforts to implement what's in writing. That's why I would like to support the European Parliament's resolution, which calls on member states to assign adequate financial and human resources to prevent and fight against violence against women, and also to afford assistance to victims. In recent months in my own country, we've seen the case of Juana Rivas, who was obliged to hand over her children to an abusive father who already had a conviction for it, because the gender violence legislation in my country doesn't allow for withdrawing custody from any abusers. An abuser can't be a good father. So we've got to go beyond the convention. It's a pressing need. It's a pressing need for us to have a European directive to fight against gender violence, violence against women, something that all member states would have to act on. Thank you.
Herr Agnew, eine Minute.
Mr. Agnew now, 1 minute.
Thank you. In my country, the UK, I think is sliding backwards into medieval times. In my childhood, the following 5 crimes had been virtually unheard of, and they are now commonplace: female genital mutilation, breast ironing, forced marriage, which is effectively legalised rape, honour violence, which includes killing, and sexual grooming of vulnerable white girls by Asian men. There is an enormous reluctance to prosecute the perpetrators of these crimes because they are either from ethnic minorities or adherents to Islam. And it's considered politically incorrect to criticise such groups generically. It is called racism. Political correctness is the cornerstone of this European Union, and it is doing enormous damage to the safety of women. We now have a situation where perceived racism is a more serious crime than actual rape. We have got to stop political correctness and defend women. Thank you.
Alle Verbrechen müssen verfolgt werden.
All crimes need to be dealt with when you're living under the rule of law. That seems clear. Mr. Svoboda now, 1.5 minutes.
Předsedající, vážená paní komisařko.
So thank you very much, Madam President. Commissioner, I welcome the Council's proposal that the EU should become a signatory of this convention. And of course, it should do so with the competences of the EU. It's also very important for the EU to respect the principle of subsidiarity. Now, I'd like to home in on the text of resolution. I think it touches on issues which are the responsibility of the member states and member states. And citizens want an efficient EU that respects the principle of subsidiarity. And I'm not at all convinced that if you support this text, you're actually delivering on the expectations that citizens have of the European Union. I think this actually, what you're doing here, undermines the Istanbul Convention. The topic of violence against women is way too important for this kind of drift. Violence must be fought against, but it can be very difficult for women who are excluded from society or who are victims of violence to be reintegrated into society. Violence is penalized in all criminal codes, in all our member states. Now, previously, I have not voted in favor of resolutions that overstep into the member states' competences, and I can't do so here too. Thank you.
Tack så mycket, fru ordförande, fru kommissionär. Rådande könsmaktsordning är en global struktur som innebär att män som grupp är...
Now, we have a global structure here at the moment in our society, and basically the situation is that men are in a better situation than women. Men have control over women, and they can exercise that control. I mean, gender-based violence is carried out by men in 90% of cases, and therefore I think we should redefine the terms that we use. The policies that we run are also patriarchal in nature. They are basically based on the military and aggressiveness. Women are also controlled financially by men, and therefore it's important to ensure that we can do away with this danger for women. We need to ensure that we have a society that is free of violence, and to do that we need a different agenda for when it comes to safety and security. So I support the report fully. Thank you. Mr. WIŚNIEWSKI, you have 1 minute.
Thank you, President. Ladies and gentlemen, all types of violence against women are something that we should fight against. But let us not pretend that the Istanbul Convention is a magic wand that will free us from that problem. The Istanbul Convention is unfortunately an ideological solution that is supposed to support victims of violence, but in fact changes the social climate according to the gender ideology and radical feminism. Will MEPs who will be voting tomorrow really be willing to sign a document that proves that violence against women is an element that has been present since always in the European society? But that's the idea that it expresses. Of course, the victims are innocent, but accession to an ideological convention will be yet another tragic mistake by the EU. So I would like to call upon all the MEPs to reject it. Thank you.
Mr. Sogor, 1.5 minutes, please.
Európai nők egyharmadát legalább egyszer érte felnőtt életében fizikai erőszak.
Well, around 1/3 of European women will suffer some kind of physical violence during their lives. But these are only the reported cases. The actual number of cases is very likely to be far larger, but the victims are often dependent on the perpetrators. I mean, when I think of my family, I can see that this is a major problem. I mean, this is a systematic violation of fundamental rights and the dignity of women. These are crimes that must be punished. Equality is a fundamental value in the European Union, and therefore I welcome the EU's accession to this convention. All member states have already signed the convention. Only 14 have actually ratified it, though. Now, violence against women is also very expensive for the European Union. There's a lot of money spent. We need to spend money not only on helping victims, etc., but also on prevention. I think here the media play a major role, and they should be involved together with NGOs when it comes to leading campaigns to raise awareness. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And our next speaker is Madame Liliana Rodrigues. I give you the floor.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. President, Madam Commissioner. I'm not going to talk about the personal damage or the figures that relating to gender violence. We know all about this. We also know what the financial cost of all of this is, but the cost on the body and soul of women cannot be quantified. Violence against women affects too many citizens that live in the European Union. That's why it's essential for the Istanbul Convention to be ratified, and this has got to be backed up by other measures. Austerity policies have to be stopped because they promote inequality. That's why, Madam Commissioner, it is pressingly urgent for a legal act to be proposed which will support Member States in preventing and eliminating all forms of violence against women and girls. We're talking human rights here. This is a competence of the European Union. But this can't be done without addressing education. It's regrettable that we've got to hang around for the passerelle clause to be used to fight against gender violence. I think we should be far more united in this struggle. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Rikke KARLSSON. I give you the floor.
Colleagues, in my world, we all have the image of responsibility. We know that there are cases of violence against women. Women are raped. They're hit, they're victims of physical violence, sometimes they're killed in their own homes. And something has to be done about this. This is why I'm very much in favor of the subject which is before us today. I think that we need stronger legislation to really tackle this phenomenon so as to help the victims and the thousands of children who suffer every day and who run the risk of losing their lives, and we must try to better their fate. In the EU, we are trying to build common values and trust, and I think that we must always take our distances vis-à-vis violence, regardless of the type of violence. Now, the member states themselves can deal with this, but others as well. The important thing is that we send out a clear signal, which is that violence must not occur, regardless of its origin.
Thank you very much. And now Péter NIEDERMÜLLER.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thanks very much. I'm sorry that we have to come back to this. We have to come back to discussing the Istanbul Convention and how we can use it to promote gender equality, because the gender equality is a fundamental value, and it's simply not the case. It's just a private matter if there's domestic violence against women. This is a way of destroying democracy. We're talking about issues that are hugely complex. They tie with education, culture, all sorts of things. All of these aspects need to be taken account of, and of course all legislation must be implemented. All member states therefore really have to ratify this convention, but unfortunately this isn't really happening, and there are still too many member states that haven't ratified this. This state wants to prevent women, it would seem, to carry out abortions, like as if it was Russia, and I think it's essential for us to ratify and implement this convention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Madame TREBESIUS.
Thank you very much, President. Well, there's a very large number of women who report that they've been victims of gender violence, and new forms of violence against women are emerging with the stream of migrants who are coming to Europe. For example, honour killings, child marriages, female, etc. Now, all these things are banned in my country and lead to women and girls being driven into parallel societies. Now, the latest court rulings from Germany show that for men culture is more important than the rights of women. I think that the fact that these kinds of things are taking place in the heart of Europe is tragic. I mean, on my way to the airport in Hamburg, I went through many neighborhoods where many women were wearing burqas, etc., and no women were wearing miniskirts, etc., and I think that's a sign that we need to act, and therefore I welcome the Istanbul Convention and the fact the European Union is going to accede to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Tarabella is the next speaker.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, first of all, congratulations to the rapporteur, Madame Revaud-Dallon and Madame Corazza-Bildt, for their work. I, too, am really struck by the dramatic situation afflicting too many women and children. Human rights are often denied to these women who are victims of domestic violence. How can we still say that 1 woman out of 20 was raped in Europe, 1 out of 3 is the victim of physical violence at a young age or as a young adult? So it's important to react as individuals, but together as well, to define a common strategy which will ensure equal protection of our citizens, our female citizens in the EU. What I'm rather shocked about is that some of our very conservative colleagues from different political groups hide behind the principle of subsidiarity to reject this text. That is a very conservative approach. This is definitely not going to ensure progress towards a better situation, which would be ensured by the ratification of the Istanbul Convention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, Madame Chinnici.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, violence against women, unfortunately, is continuing. The figures are dreadful. 1/3 of women are the victims of physical violence at least once in their lives. Now, in this scenario, the Istanbul Convention provides appropriate legal tools not only to prosecute those who've committed these crimes, but to prevent violence against women. And the accession of the EU to the Convention is a strong signal in favor of the too many women who are the victims of violence. I hope that all member states will implement that convention, as my country did, for instance, where just a few days ago guidelines were approved providing for preventive measures, education, support programs for the victims, and closer cooperation between the Ministry for Justice and the courts in order to punish those who are guilty. We need an integrated European policy against any form of violence against women. This is where we definitely cannot just turn a blind eye.
Thank you very much, Madame Borzan. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. The entire process of ratification of the Istanbul Convention takes too long. A year and a half have passed, and we are still having discussions. This is very disappointing. 7 women die every day in the EU as a result of violence. I am particularly concerned by the surveys showing that violence has become acceptable in school-age children. It has become normal to verbally or physically abuse a girl if she doesn't act in line with expectations of others. Women face discrimination on a daily basis. The situation is particularly hard if they are persons with disability or belong to the LGBTI group. I'm shocked that there are those who seek to eliminate gender equality even in the document of such importance, or even claim that the Istanbul Convention endangers the rights of women. I support this report as it seeks full and urgent ratification of the Convention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Head.
Thank you, President. The Istanbul Convention is a step in the right direction to ensure equality between men and women. Very often violence is due to the lack of equality between the genders. It's structurally linked to gender, and it's important that all the member states ratify the convention, that they take on their responsibility and that they really try to do something about this violence perpetrated by men against women, because the nice wording of the convention will mean nothing if the letter of the convention is not implemented. What is important from the point of view of Parliament is that sexual and reproductive health rights are important. There's the right to abortion as well. And it is important that the text be implemented. Now, I thought that we had agreed in the committee with regard to our position. And Madam Corazza-Bildt, you seem to have left out a section with regard to the LGBTI and the EPP's position on these matters.
Thank you very much. Madam Head, will you accept the blue card from Madam Corazza-Bildt?
Madam. Bardzo proszę.
Madam Corazza-Bildt, I give you the floor.
Chairman, jag vill fråga min kära kollega Anna Hed. Jag tillhör EPP. Jag vill...
Could I put a question to Anna Hed? Now, I've worked very hard on this report. And that was precisely what we wanted to do. And the idea was that the committee come up with a proposal for EU accession to the convention. This has not yet been actually voted on, so you can actually go back to the EPP on this and tackle the issue with them. We're talking about domestic violence against women. We don't want any tolerance with regard to this in the EPP. Thank you.
Det är många som har efterfrågat ett arbete från EU mot mäns våld.
We have emphasized the work which has been done in the EU about combating this whole phenomenon of men and their violence against women. But I'm rather disappointed because the EPP seems to be leaving out important issues, issues where there was an agreement in the committee. That's what I'm rather disappointed about.
Thank you very much for this response. Ladies and gentlemen, we have enough time to listen to all who want to speak within Catch the Eye. We have 11 people on my list, and I wanted to thank you to sticking to your time, and thanks to this we can listen to more people now. And the first person within the Catch the Eye procedure will be Madame Šojdrová.
Děkuji, vážený pane místopředsedo. Evropský parlament.
Mr. President, the European Parliament keeps on arguing in favor of accession of the Convention of Istanbul. Now, any kind of violence is a very sad reality, particularly in a highly developed society such as Europe. We can't hide our head in the sand about this. Now, I understand the proposal that the European Union should accede to the Convention in the areas for which the EU is responsible, asylum and other issues. The EU should help member states in their efforts, and it should encourage them to implement what they can. In the Czech Republic in 2006, legislation was adopted against domestic violence. Now, I agree with Mrs. Corazza-Bildt that zero tolerance must be our watchword on women's violence or violence against women. So
thank you very much, Madam Sehnalová.
Děkuji, pane místopředsedo, vážená paní komisařko, kolegyně a kolegové. Tématu domácího
Commissioner, colleagues, the issue that we're discussing here is coming up again. 1 in 3 women in the EU has suffered some kind of gender-based violence. Now this is reprehensible, and also what's terrible is that up to 80% have suffered physical or some kind of psychological violence, whereas the perpetrators are barely ever punished. Victims don't feel that they can turn to the police, and that's also part of the problem. I think the only way to deal with is an international instrument, and I think that's where the Istanbul Convention comes in. It provides states with a duty to prevent the crimes and prosecute perpetrators. It's a good thing that all EU member states have signed up to the convention, but signing it is not enough. There's still a long way to go. Thank you.
Thank you very much for speaking exactly for 60 seconds, Mr. Marias.
Dziękuję bardzo, Mr. President. Συζητούμε σήμερα το κορυφαίο γεγονός.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today we're discussing domestic violence and violence against women. On 23rd of November 2016, I had the opportunity to rise and speak in the European Parliament. We were discussing the European succession to the Istanbul Convention. And this was taking place at a time where poverty is something that could be used as a means of pressuring women. Let's not forget that there are also other phenomena such as Sharia, female genital mutilation and so forth. These are crimes which are absolutely appalling. I believe that accession to this convention could make a very substantial contribution to protecting minors and to ensuring that perpetrators are prosecuted. And also the convention should be used as a mechanism against to promote the return of illegal migrants.
Thank you very much. Gesine Meissner, please.
President, I would like to thank the Commissioner and the 2 rapporteurs for their work. It's extremely important for the EU to also have the support of the Istanbul Convention. I mean, obviously all member states should ratify and sign up, but and obviously it's clear that ratifying this convention isn't going to do away with violence against women. I mean, the point is, however, that we do need to do something. I mean, people are saying that violence against women is something that's come to Europe with refugees. Well, that's nonsense. We've always had violence against women. I mean, now we have more vulnerable women in Europe, and I think it's a very good thing that the Maltese presidency has dealt with preventing violence and dealt with certain issues surrounding pregnancy. And this is something that we're also dealing with in Germany. The federal government is supporting women, and the point here is to ensure that you bring men with you and that you raise awareness among men as to what our culture is. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo. Jako następna mówczyni pani Maria Lidia.
The next speaker is Madam Rodriguez, please.
Obrigada, Presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President. We welcome the ratification of the Istanbul Convention, but Madam Commissioner, we believe that the European Union should move from words to deeds. We women want to live a life without violence. That's why we are looking forward to a European directive that will strengthen the fight against sexist violence. We call on the member states to ensure that legislation is implemented. They should look into what's not working, what's not being implemented. It's not acceptable that all the people who have to implement anti-gender violence legislation But these people need to be trained as well, because we can't have a sexist implementation of anti-sexist legislation. We can't allow cases such as Juana Rivas' case happen again. No more women should face prison just because they don't want to hand over their children to abuser fathers. Thank you.
Dziękuję uprzejmie. Pani Mariana Petir, bardzo proszę.
Ms. Petir.
Gospodine predsjedniče, najoštrije osuđujem nasilje nad ženama. Smatram ga u potpunosti neprihvatljivim.
Thank you. I firmly condemn all forms of violence, and I think it is utterly unacceptable. The Istanbul Convention is going against the principle of subsidiarity. This is the first international treaty of the Council of Europe where member states did not take part in devising it. A large number of member states did not ratify the convention, and we should ask ourselves the question why. Because the problem is that gender there is defined not as that a person is being born as a male or female, but they choose their gender, which goes against the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which has got a legally binding definition of male and female and gender. Fighting against violence is something that we can do by education, upbringing, and not by introducing a new ideology.
Tibor Shani.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tibor Shani.
Köszönöm szépen a lehetőséget, tisztelt elnök úr.
Thank you very much, President. Let me begin by saying that I fully agree with the proposal for the European Union to accede the Istanbul Convention. Unfortunately, Hungary hasn't ratified the convention, and this isn't an issue that's on the table in Hungary, the ratification. So we need to do more. In the EU, over 1,000 women a year are beaten to death by their partners or by other male relatives, and that really is a shocking statistic. That means that there are more women who are victims of domestic violence than there are victims of terrorist attacks. There is one clear comment that we're making here today with today's debate. There can be no tolerance of violence against women and also violence against the elderly and children. I'm very pleased that I can give this speech on my wife's birthday. Thank you very much.
Dziękuję bardzo. Pozdrawiamy wobec tego.
Thank you very much. All the best to your wife for her birthday. And our next speaker is Madam Róża Tomasić.
Zastupnica Tomasić. Thank you, Chair. A family is the cornerstone of our society. Unfortunately, in some cases, a family home, instead of being a place of refuge, becomes a dungeon. We must ensure support and security to victims of domestic violence. As a police officer, I intervened in cases of domestic violence, and I advocate zero tolerance to violence. The same applies to violence against women. A woman has the right to choose who to have sexual relations with and when, and what protection to use. As long as she makes decisions about her body and not about lives of others, a woman must have full control over her decisions. As regards any other elements of the report, such as advocating abortion, promoting gender ideology and imposing political correctness, these elements do not serve the purpose of prevention and prosecution of violence. They rather promote the liberal agenda and silencing those who have a different opinion. This ideology does not have my support, and I hope not the support of the government of the Republic of Croatia.
BECERRA.
Thank you, Mr. President. Violence against women is a brutal form of discrimination and a clear violation of human rights. It's something we see in all countries of European Union. 1 out of every 3 women in Europe have been victims of physical or sexual violence. 1 out of every 20 have suffered some kind of rape. More than half women have suffered some kind of sexual violence or harassment. 1 out of every 3 women have suffered physical or sexual violence during their childhood, and those that have fared worse have been murdered in some cases together with their children. On behalf of all of them, all of the victims, I congratulate the Commissioner, my colleague Anna Maria, and all of us who have worked hard to get the EU to accede to the Istanbul Convention, an official instrument to fight against violence, to protect victims, and to bring to book aggressors. It's one of many, many steps we need to keep taking at a European and national level. We must take these steps united, all of us. Now, one colleague was complaining about EPP. Colleagues, there are very many EPP members, Anna, Barbara, and myself and others who've spent years fighting against violence against women, and I won't accept us being called into question or our party. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo. Bardzo proszę pani Julie Ward.
Thank you very much, Madam Julie Ward.
After years of talking and endless calls for the EU to accede to the Istanbul Convention, I'm very glad the time has finally come. However, beyond tomorrow's vote, we must call for the Convention to be implemented in full and without reservations, and also call for all EU member states to do the same, including my own country, the UK, which has been dragging its heels. It is, colleagues, more urgent than ever to tackle gender-based violence. Sadly, we've seen a recent wave of attacks, intimidation and harassment of women in politics and in the public sphere. From the tragic murder of Labour MP Jo Cox in the UK last year to the torrents of online abuse against women in public life that have now become routine. We must address the root cause of violence against women and girls, and that is the culture of misogyny, sexism and objectification, which frankly allows violence to prevail. We must follow up the ratification with an ambitious European-wide strategy on gender-based violence and encourage sex and relationship education for mutual, respectful relationships.
Dziękuję bardzo. Teraz zapraszam pan poseł Marek Jurek.
Mr. Jurek, please.
Przewodniczący, panie i panowie.
President. Ladies and gentlemen, today's debate on the ratification of the Istanbul Convention was important because it showed the intentions and the possible consequences that this ratification, which I hope will not take place, may have. Those who call upon us to ratify the convention, the rapporteur, Madame Bonnefoy, said that it's the protection of life before birth, that abortion should be available for everybody. Mr. Niedermüller said the same, who was even more concrete, because he said quite explicitly that he hopes that this convention will be an instrument for pressure on his own country, which does not want, so as not to protect life before birth. So I would like to call upon Commissioner Jourová to respect those countries that want to protect life before birth. We have such a right, and it should be declared and said very clearly here today. Thank you.
Caputo, bardzo proszę.
Thank you very much, Mr. Caputo. I give you the floor, and it will be the last speaker.
Thank you, President. 74% of European citizens believe that gender violence is a common phenomenon in their respective country. About 25% of women have been victims of physical or sexual violence. 1 out of 4 Europeans believes that a sexual relationship without consent is something which can be justified. So there's a lot to be done with regard to violence against women. There are several tools available already, but after Istanbul, the Istanbul Convention, we'll have an excellent tool to deal with the phenomenon of violence against women, regardless of their age or category. The appropriate funds have to be made available to set up proper protection for women and girls. We need practical measures, so without further delay, we must ensure that the principles of the Convention are applied in national laws so that financial means are made available to implement its objectives. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we move on to our Commissioner, Madam Jourová. The floor is yours, Madam.
Mr. President, honourable members, every time we speak here about discrimination and violence against women, I have a strong feeling that we can never do enough, but we have to continue what we are doing. And I am convinced that the accession of the EU to the Istanbul Convention is an important step forward. This is the way how we can better join forces, the EU and the Member States, to come with the truly efficient and balanced mixture of preventive measures and repressive measures. And I want to emphasize that yes, we have to speak also about repression, because we speak about crime. We speak about the need to come with the efficient response from the side of the law enforcement authorities in the Member States, and to protect the women and also children better. The Istanbul Convention and the accession to the Convention will give us, among many other new things and opportunities, give us a better way of collecting data and of analysing the root causes of the violence against women. Through that, we will be able to better understand what is the role of economic dependence of women, and to encourage us to do more in this respect. What is the impact of passivity of our society? Because we see that part of our society thinks that it is normal to beat women, that the domestic violence is something which we cannot eliminate, that violence against women is something what the victims in many cases deserve. This is unacceptable, and we have to convince all our society that this is not normal. We will understand better how to assess the influence of alcohol, because this is not discussed very often, but we see that this is also a big issue. We will understand better how to encourage the victims to go and report to police, how to get them to trust more the institutions which have been established and which are in the EU to help the victims, because still we see that only about 15–20% of the victims go and report the violence. We will understand better how to achieve better enforcement of the law, and again I speak about the criminal law in the Member States. We have to understand better and come with the proper action addressing violence stemming from bad traditions and the so-called cultures, which was also discussed here. No culture is the excuse for the violence against women and children. And we should do much more to explain young boys and girls that it is not normal to accept violence, that it is not normal that their fathers beat their mothers in many cases. So we will understand better, and we will be better able to measure the trend, because you see that in European societies violence is on the rise in general, and we see this trend online. We see the increased the rise of violence against women, in bullying and in sexual harassment, and we see all that trend, and we need to be able to measure better and to come with the proper reaction. And I strongly disagree that this is the ideological issue. I cannot understand how somebody can look at it from this point of view, because violence is a crime, unacceptable according to the law. murdered woman is often a victim of sexually motivated crime. What's ideological on our effort to eliminate this from Europe? And also, I must say, in reaction on what Mr. Niedermüller said, yes, I'm worried about the development in some member states, looking at Russia as the example of the way forward. In Russia, there is the law which says that the first blow in domestic violence does not count. This is not the way where the EU should go in the 21st century. Very often when I speak about how to combat violence against women, I have in my speeches the horrifying figure of how much it costs. Some of you mentioned €230 million a year. And I'm always embarrassed to mention this figure, because this is not about the money, this is about lives and health of women and children. Ladies and gentlemen, I can confirm today on this place that I shall remain fully committed to keeping you informed on our progress in this endeavour, but also to sharing the state and results of our ongoing actions, including on the achievements and experiences from the still unfolding year of focused actions on fighting violence against women. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And now we move on to our rapporteurs. The first rapporteur. The floor is yours.
Merci, Président.
Thank you very much, President. First of all, my thanks go to Anna Maria Corazza Bildt for this very successful cooperation exercise. It was a fine thing indeed that both the Women's and Libe Committee worked together towards this successful result. So I'd like to thank all of the shadow rapporteurs for all their work. I think that working together we have achieved an ambitious text which is commensurate with our objectives. This text will have a direct impact on millions of women who, after all, account for half of our populations. Will also go to show that the European Union is prepared to protect its citizens, and I'd like to thank you, Commissioner, for your robust and clear commitment, and I would like to call on Estonia to speed up the ratification of the Convention by the Union under its presidency. We've still got a long way to go. However, there is nothing that can be used as a pretext to excuse violence against women, and using religion as a pretext in order to try and divert attention from this scourge is nothing less than scandalous. The success of the Istanbul Convention is undeniable. Equality between men and women and respect for the rule of law are part and parcel of our fundamental principles, and we will continue our struggle on all levels. As many contributors to this debate have already said, it is high time the European Union ratified this convention, and I say once again that I am confident that we will have to ensure that we adapt our legislation to prevent violence against women, and we must not allow violence and crimes against women. If we ratify the convention, then we will be able to fully implement the provisions of this convention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Rapporteur. Now, co-rapporteur Anna Maria Corazza Bildt has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Commissioner. I'm really glad that we have actually reached a broad consensus across political groups. Thank you, Christine, and all the other shadows. Together, we are saying stop violence against women. And we share this common goal, colleagues. It is just about reaching and increasing more stronger tools that we are doing this report. And our report is a wake-up call to the member states to do more. And time has come to move really from words to action. Member states have to overcome their reservation and speed up the EU accession and ensure a broader scope, not only cooperation in justice and criminal law and asylum and non-refoulement. And some points raised by colleagues. Cooperation in criminal law is a EU competence foreseen by the Lisbon Treaty. We have already tools at EU level to combat serious crimes, trafficking, sexual abuse, protection of victims, and recently even the directive to combat terrorism. And I would like to join the call to the Commission to propose a legislative act on violence against women as a way to strengthen our capabilities. I also understand, colleagues, the concerns and the controversy on the wording gender. You know how much throughout the process I reached out with genuine goodwill to clarify, bridge the gap and leave no misunderstanding. And the definition of gender-based violence in the Commission, according to the Council of Europe, is violence done to a woman and a girl just because she is a woman and a girl. It is no ideology, it is no hidden agenda, definitely nothing against Christian or family values. And I do ask the Commission again to clarify, together with the Council of Europe, this misleading interpretation and engage in dialogue with the Member States on the issues that prevent the full ratification and implementation. And I fully support the work of the Council of Europe Grevio, but they should speed it up. A last point, Mr. Chair, if you allow me, raised by colleagues, is the issue of migrants having also rights and duties and having to respect our laws, and religious culture never being an excuse to oppress women. Respect for women should become a social norm, but we can never stigmatize migrants for violence in Europe. Women and girls on the move are actually victims of violence, the slavery of our time. Let's, colleagues, have a special focus on children and continue to put pressure on the Member States. The European Parliament, the EPP, will continue to commit to zero tolerance against violence against women and to keep it at the top of the EU agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Co-Rapporteur. I would like to thank Madam Commissioner for her participation in this debate as well. The debate is hereby closed. The voting will take place tomorrow. Now we can pass on to the next item on our agenda, which is the report by Julie Girling, EU Emissions Trading System, continuing current limitations of scope for aviation activities and preparing to implement a global market-based measure from